I think a lot of people pass by and never know what's behind it. I'm always really pleased to see the gates open, and I think people are often very surprised at how big it is. And I think the history of it is quite interesting in that it was the site both of a Catholic church and indeed of what became the Church of Ireland church.
Yes.
That doesn't happen that often in places like this, and maybe we should have a little bit more of that coming together in the future.
Do you feel a special kind of sacred atmosphere in this place?
I do. From the very moment I came in this place, there is a real feeling of peace in here. There is. And it's actually, if that's not a paradox, it's actually palpable. You feel that the blood pressure comes down once you come into the gate. It is a real oasis in the city, and primarily in Donnybrook village. And they believe that Saint Brock had her little convent or whatever dwelling she had right on this spot, and it is probably the prime spot in Donnybrook, isn't it?
I think so. I think this was here before there was Dublin City,
Without a doubt.
and it was probably the start of Donnybrook Village as well,
Yeah,
which now has been incorporated into Dublin and is subject to a lot of building going on around it. So I hope that this can be kept preserved.
Yeah.
And he survived until about 1942. And the last mail west, was killed in a car crash in the early 1960s. The lady who asked me earlier, do I ever feel a presence here? The only presence I've ever felt here has been beneficent, friendly. not a great deal.
Well, I've been reading about them, and I know that in 1879 they were building foundations for some new townhouses on Seaview Avenue near Aylesbury Road, and they found 600 bodies of men, women, and children in a mass grave there. And they were violently killed. They found one Viking. They figured they were killed in a Viking raid, and it was the 10th century. It could have been people from St. Thomas as well. So those bodies were all brought up here and reburied here. Now they also, in 1931, when they were widening the road, they had to go into the cemetery and they found another mass grave. Don't know how many were in it, but they dug them all up and they buried them in the south side of the cemetery.
I see. A Norwegian friend of mine heard that story and took grave exception to the way the Vikings were described.
All right. So they didn't get a very good press here in Ireland, that's for
They
sure.
didn't, but on the other hand, they found in Waterford, Dublin, Arklow, and Drogheda, I think, too.
Drogheda, right.
And they were here for about 300 years. You know,
So they weren't just killing and massacring.
no, I mean,
Tell me.
I thought actually that they just came and raided and went away.
They did for a while,
Yeah.
but then they decided to settle, evidently.
Yeah,
They probably became Irish.
I'm sure that they did, because we Irish are quite a mixture.
Yes.
You know, we're Viking, Irish, Norman, Huguenot, English, Welsh, you know, and I'm delighted about that. And today we have a new influx,
Yeah.
which pleases me.
Can you tell us when was the first burial in that graveyard and when was the last burial?
First recorded burial that I'm aware of was around 1714. Now, there were other burials prior to that, but the current records just go back to about 1714. The last burial was in 1936, and I'm not sure it was the daughter or the granddaughter of the Reverend Arthur Gore Ryder. Arthur Gore Ryder died in 1888. He was the rector of St. Mary's Parish, Donnybrook.
How many people, how many gravestones are there altogether?
I can't tell you the number of gravestones, but I can tell you that according to Danny Parkinson's book, up to 7,000 burials have taken place there. And one register of that is that if you walk up the laneway alongside it, you'll find the walls are bulging outwards and they've been buttressed, because as the cemetery filled, the pressure on the walls increased. I think that the earliest stone, which is not really decipherable now, belongs to a family. I think it could be Vincent. I'm not sure of this now, but the date is reputed to be 1625. Now, it's not very legible, and there are some stones from the late 17th century which are legible from around, we'll say, 1680. You asked about the number of gravestones. So what I'd say to you is, the impression I have is that the majority of burials in the 19th century of humble, less well-off people, which most of us would have been at the time, are not marked. What you also find when you look at the records is the very large number of children who were buried there, babies and children especially, because as we know, diseases like measles and mumps and chickenpox, which could be dealt with now, were often fatal then. And for instance, a typical grave is the West family grave, which I mentioned during the last tour. The Wests lost between about February 1847 and about June 1848 4 children, which, even accounting for the high child mortality at the time, must have been a terrible blow to that family. They were a well-off family. Obviously, they didn't die from starvation during the famine, but they could have died from a poor water supply, and also the fact that there was a lot of disease in the city at the time.
David, can you just mention when you started giving the tour and how often you do it?
I began to give the tour in the summer of 2006 when I retired. At first I gave it intermittently, but now in the summertime I give it every fortnight.
And can I ask you how you got involved with graveyards? Have you always been interested in graveyards, or was the Donnybrook graveyard a particular interest for you?
Well, what actually happened was I have a very good friend called Raymond Bateson who has written a lot about cemeteries. And about 3 weeks before I retired, he rang me up and said, "David, June the 1st starts European Cemeteries Week. Will you give a tour at Donnybrook?" And that's how I became involved. So we went along together one very cold May morning. It was freezing cold, I remember. He explained things to me which I didn't retain, because the only way I can learn anything is by doing it. And then 3 weeks later I retired, and on the night of my retirement he said, there's a notice about your tour in the Irish Times, and there are very few fellows on the retirement night who are given an announcement in the Irish Times. So I gave the first tour on a Saturday, and I remember as I gave it, I was hoping it would end soon, and yet within 2 or 3 weeks I grew to love it, and I've been involved ever since. Initially I used the material written by Danny Parkinson, but soon I began to do my own research. First of all, I went to Pearse Street Library, that's the reference library. And the reference library is particularly good because it has street directories of Dublin from before 1800. Therefore, if you know someone is buried at the cemetery, you can trace where they lived. And in some cases, you can even trace how they moved around. I also go to the library of the representative church body in Ireland. That's the representative church body of the Church of Ireland. And there you will find the parish records for St. Mary's Parish.
David, could you tell us something about this inscription for the Graves family?
Yes, indeed. Here are deposited the remains of Matilda Jane, wife of Robert James Graves, Esquire, medical doctor, who died September the 1st, 1825, aged 19 years. Matilda Jane died in childbirth, and just over 2 years later, the second wife of Sarah, the second wife of Robert James Graves, also died. And then 5.5 years later, the child of Matilda Jane and Robert James Graves died at the age of 5.5 because medicine was very underdeveloped at the time.
Even though he was a doctor.
Even though he was a doctor, there was almost no knowledge about bacteria and germs. But when I came to this cemetery, in a way I felt very much at home, because from the age of 19 I had loved the book Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, and Robert James Graves was a forebear of Robert Graves the writer. In fact, Robert Graves' great-grandfather, John Crosby Graves, is actually buried here at this spot, in this same place. He was the chief magistrate of Dublin, and he died in the year 1835, and his daughter Clarissa married the German historian Leopold von Ranke. The inscription is on the archway over the entrance, and it sounds very grand. You're told that his name was Mr. Thomas Chamney Seawright, Registrar of the Dublin Stock Exchange, who died at the end of May 1890. A very grand, ringing sort of name. And when I explored the circumstances of his death, I found it very interesting, and it somehow brought the context of the 1890s into view also. as the registrar of the Dublin Stock Exchange, he would have been, you could say, at the peak of Dublin society. And he died at the age of 67 at the end of May 1890. And the Irish Times gives you an account of his funeral.
Can you tell us, where did you find the two portraits that you have of the bishop and his wife?
Well,
how did you get them?
Well, actually, finding the portrait brought me a shock of recognition. I've been giving the tour for a number of years, and one day I walked into the National Gallery and there was this portrait of the bishop and his wife, and I felt that I knew them almost. I'd been speaking and thinking about them for a couple of years, and here they were. And they emerge as a very powerful looking couple. I believe that there was an 18th century diarist called Mrs. Delaney, and she speaks of going to their house. They were very hospitable, and she describes one room as being hung with red silk, and coincidentally there is a red background to the portrait. Now, Bishop Clayton and his wife built Ivy House, which is on St. Stephen's Green. And I was delighted to discover that the house is structurally at least, practically the same as the Claytons built it. It is now the headquarters of the Irish Foreign Service. While we were there, we were shown another portrait of Bishop Clayton. I was very interested to hear that it had been given to the nation by Adam Clayton of U2. You know, I don't know if he's related to him or not, but I thought it was a very fine gesture. Bishop Clayton had a tragic end. It was said of him that he was a man of great intellect but of poor judgment, and sadly for him, he found he could not fully accept the doctrine of the Trinity, which was a very difficult place for a bishop of the established church to find himself in. He was called before an ecclesiastical court, and the poor man died the previous night, obviously from stress. But Bishop Clayton and his wife have left Dublin a great gift, and it's there for all to see and to enjoy.
I understand that Leonard McNally is buried here. Could you tell us something about the inscription here?
Yes, well, the inscription is really very spare. There is just the date 1688, the name Nally, and a skull and crossbones signifying death. When the sun really shines, you can see them both clearly. And the Reverend Beaver Blacker said he was very tired of people asking him about Leonard McNally's grave.
Well, you were saying that you had some misgivings when you had
The very first time I heard of Leonard McNally was when I was 23, and I didn't hear of him again until many, many years later. I went to Donnybrook Cemetery. I was in Richmond in Yorkshire. I was working in England at the time, and one day I went to the local museum, and there was a copy of The Lass of Richmond Hill, a ballad there, and it goes in part, "I'd crowns resign to call thee mine, fair lass of Richmond Hill." And at the bottom was the author's name, and it was Leonard McNally. And it clicked with me that it was an Irish name, but I knew nothing about him, until my friend Raymond Bateson took me to the cemetery and told me that Leonard McNally was buried there. And Leonard, when I first stood over his grave to speak about him, I felt very uncomfortable indeed, because I was saying something at a man's grave that was not to his credit. He was a lawyer and a playwright, and he was also a member of the United Irishmen. And in 1794, an agent of the French government came to Dublin, and he came to find out whether or not, in the event of a French invasion, whether the Irish people would rise in revolt. And he came to visit Leonard McNally. I think the gentleman's name, he was a clergyman, was the Reverend Forrester. And when the Reverend Forrester was passing through London, he looked up an old friend of his and unfortunately told him his purpose in coming to Dublin. He was trailed and he came to Leonard McNally's house. And when he was there, McNally, who was in the United Irishman and a lawyer, while he was there consulting with the Reverend Forrester, the police, or the equivalent of the police, arrived and they were arrested. However it turned out, the Reverend Forrester was put on trial and Leonard McNally was his defending counsel. But he defended him so poorly that the Reverend Forrester was found guilty and he was executed. And later on, McNally was the lawyer for Robert Emmet. But at McNally's death, it was found that he had been in correspondence with Dublin Castle all the time. And the story emerged in the most foolish way. He had left his family badly provided for, and his son wrote to the castle asking that the Secret Service stipend be continued. And of course the story was all out then. But I read afterwards that the explanation may be this, that McNally found himself in a dreadful situation. He may have been told by the authorities that he would have his freedom provided he continued to cooperate with them. And this is thought to have happened. So it's believed he continued to provide information to the Dublin Castle authorities about the United Irishman and about Emmet and those associated with him. And again, he was the defending counsel for Robert Emmet, but no one knew at the time that he was in contact with Dublin Castle, providing information all the time. And as I say, I found myself in a most uncomfortable position when I first gave the tour there. In fact, I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm not, but I was so uncomfortable that evening that I went home and I had a mass said for the repose of his soul, because it's an awkward thing to stand at a man's grave and say something that's not to his credit. What I always say now is, no one knows how people get themselves into these situations, and it's better not to come to judgment about it.
I understand this is the grave of Richard Robert Madden, who's the historian of the United Irishmen, and I believe you have a copy of the inscription?
Yes, indeed, and it reads, "Pray for the soul of Richard Robert Madden, medical doctor, youngest son of Edward Madden, author of many works, much loved, distinguished for talent, piety and benevolence. Born in Dublin, August the 20th, 1798, died in Booterstown, February the 5th, 1886, and for the soul of his relict, Mrs. Harriet Madden, born in London, August 14th, 1803, died in Booterstown, February the 7th, 1888, a good wife, a most loving mother, and a fervent Catholic. May they have eternal peace and happiness. Amen."
And he was, in many respects, a unique man for his time. He is well remembered for his history of the United Irishmen, and also as a great worker against slavery. Around the year 1833, he was in the service of the British government, and he was sent to Jamaica to supervise the emancipation of the slaves. Britain was one of the first countries to emancipate its slaves, and he was sent there to supervise the process. It was a strange, cumbersome kind of process, because instead of being freed right away, slaves were first of all enrolled in a kind of an apprenticeship. And they passed through this apprenticeship over 3 years, and at the end of it, they emerged into freedom. The ironic thing was they were given no compensation whatsoever, while the slave owners who no longer had the service of the slaves were compensated by the government. And I heard somewhere that amongst the families which were compensated was the family of David Cameron. That's the recent Prime Minister of Britain. Madden was interested in everything, and he was eventually sent to West Africa to also attend to the freeing of the slaves. He also, before he went to Africa, I think, found Anne Devlin, the helper of Robert Emmet. She was living in very poor circumstances in Dublin. She was a widow with a number of children, and he assisted her. His work took him away, and when he returned, he found that she had died. And in his view, she had been buried in a pauper's grave at Glasnevin Cemetery, and he had her body exhumed and placed in what he considered to be a more honoured place, and it rests under a Celtic cross there today. You walk past all of the stones at the cemetery, and you sometimes forget that there's a story behind each one. And one stone there, which is about 9 feet high and which is well inscribed, covers the entire story of a single family in the space of 10 years. John Blythe and from County Meath and Hannah Blythe from Ringsend married in 1862. John's occupation is given as clerk at the Dodder Chemical Works, which amazed me because this was at the time of the American Civil War, and I found it difficult to realise that there were chemical factories in Dublin at this time. They married, they settled down, and they lived at Sir John Rogerson's Quay. I sometimes go near Sir John Rogerson's Quay now, but it's no longer an industrial area. It's a place of glass and steel buildings and very modern. But in the year 1867, Hannah lost her entire family. She lost her young son and daughter, who would have been both aged under 6, and she lost her husband at the age of 33 in the same year. And I wondered, was there any factor which accounted for this? And I checked Thom's Directory, and I found that in 1867, during that period, there were 4 chemical factories at Sir John Rogerson's Quay where they lived. And that, to me, surely has to be a direct connection between the shortness of their lives and the area. And Hannah herself died 5 years later, in the year 1872. She was by then living at Lower Mount Street, not very far away from Sir John Rogerson's Quay. And it seems to me as if the family had been killed by the foul environment at the time.
Well, Dermot Lacey is my name. I'm a Dublin City Councillor for this area and then former Lord Mayor of Dublin. But more importantly, in this context, I was the chairman of a group that about 30 years ago reopened and restored this graveyard, rebuilt a lot of the gravestones, reinstated the footpaths, planted a number of trees. And it's sort of timely and poignant that we're doing it now because the man who really led the project, who worked on the project, Tony Boyle, passed away 3 months ago. So I was actually passing by here today, saw it open because I have this idea of putting a chair or a bench or something just to mark Tony's contribution to this project. Tony is the person who really did most of the work that has led to the possibility of this graveyard being open to the public.
Could you tell us some of the things Tony did here?
Well, Tony did many things here. He rebuilt many of the gravestones. He clambered down into the tombs of some of the gravestones, cleaned them out of a lot of debris and rubbish because the graveyard had been closed for about 80 years at that stage. put in new flagstones around them, cleaned them up, spray cleaned them, cut away an awful lot of overgrowth that had been put here, put back to patched over here. And Tony with a team now, mind you, but Tony was the leader of that team, and he did a great job.
And how many were in his team? Were they
I think
FOSS
we
employees?
had about 10 FOSS employees. It wasn't FOSS in those days, it was National Manpower Service, but it was a similar scheme to FOSS, a community employment scheme. And we were one of the very first in the country. We were very lucky because the patron of our project was the then Minister, Rory Quinn, who kept on encouraging us and supporting us to do this sort of thing. And indeed Rory, along with the Lord Mayor, the then Lord Mayor of Dublin, Carmen Feed Hedeman, reopened the graveyard in I think it was 1988, the Dublin Millennium Year. So it's been open to the public again for about 29 years.
Hi Alan, it's great to meet you. I'm Glenda, making a film here.
How are you?
And I understand that it's your grandfather, Danny Parkinson, who wrote this book about the graveyard.
It is, yeah. It was his second book.
Second book? What
Second
was
book. His first one was about the Huguenot Cemetery on Marion Row,
Oh,
which is
really?
off Stephen's Green. I think that sort of piqued his interest for this one, but I don't know whether he'd been researching it for a long time beforehand or whatever, but certainly once he finished the other one, he threw himself wholeheartedly into this one.
Oh, and what was he like? Like, you were a kid, obviously, when he was working on this. What was he doing before he started working on this book? What was his regular job?
Well, he worked for Phillips for donkey's years. Worked for Guinness's before that. He spent a lot of time playing sport. Played hockey, soccer, cricket. He was very involved with a lot of local clubs, sort of effective across the road. Marion Cricket Club down in Anglesey Road. He played with St James's Gate. Played hockey for Leinster.
I want you to tell me something. I know you were a kid, but what do you remember about the launch of Danny's book about the cemetery?
So it was launched in Kylie's, it's a local pub around here. Family, friends, local dignitaries, and one dignitary in particular was Mary Robinson, who turned up and was, there was photographs taken. Danny was absolutely delighted with himself. A nice big launch. I think I was old enough to be allowed into a pub at that stage, so I think he got the wallet out.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to say about Danny or anything?
Well, he was widely known. Grew up in Donnybrook, spent his whole life in Donnybrook, and his family were, from Donnybrook for years and years and years. And I think now, for the first time, I think in nearly 100 years, there's actually no Parkinson's there in Donnybrook.
Really?
Yeah. So it is nice to have, this being done for, some sort of memory of him. But hopefully now some of the Parkinson's will get back into Donnybrook if they win the lottery, maybe, or something like that.
And David is continuing to reprint this book, which means it's still available, which is great.
Yeah.
And it's a
selling it
wonderful
down.
story,
Selling it down the road. It was first, actually, I think when it was first released, it was being sold over in Kylie's and Long's, which was the pub across the road.
Yeah, which is
I think it was being sold out of there. There wasn't organised tours like David was doing. People used to just ring Danny and say, right, on kid, I'll bring you around for a tour. And he'd probably bored him to death a bit, but he was passionate about it. So as I said, it kept him sort of active and out and about and moving. So it was good from that point of view.
Yeah. How old was he when he died? Do you
He
remember?
was 93.
He lasted a good long while.
Oh yeah. He lived a good 20 odd years longer than my grandmother did. So it was either 3 or 4 years ago he died. So.
Right.
He was still out and about and active, and there's a lot of people could tell you all sorts of tales about him. Let's just suffice it to say that if you heard a car beeping at you and driving across the road in his latter years, it was probably him. As he coming over to say hello.
Tell us who you are and what your connection is with Donnybrook Cemetery.
Yeah, my name is Michal Muckibone, and I'm a long-term resident of Donnybrook. But I was introduced to the old Donnybrook graveyard about 8 years ago by John Houlihan. I used to come here with him. He's the chairman of the local historical society. That's the Balls Bridge, Donnybrook and Sandymount Historical Society. And David Neary, his colleague, obviously carried on, had been for quite a number of years previous, carrying out his tour in the graveyard here, yeah. And prior to that, John Hula would normally come down on his own and spruce the place up in advance of David Neary's tour. Just have the place looking well. And I came down initially with him to help him out, and I'm here since.
Can you tell me, are you paid by Dublin City Council or are you a volunteer?
No, I'm not paid by Dublin City Council.
Or anybody else?
Or anybody else for that matter. I put into action the old axiom that you do what lies under your nose with the tools that come to your hand.
Tell us some of the things that you've done here to spruce the place up.
Well, particular areas of this old graveyard were very much overgrown and pretty much inaccessible. And this little quadrant that we're in here now, this was particularly badly overgrown. And the hay, graves, monuments were pretty much covered. And that wall there, which would probably be the northern wall, was pretty badly covered with ivy.
And you took all that down yourself?
I did, yeah. And
pretty big job.
Yeah, and from the corner at the back of the old Garda station there, I increased the access in around that area because it tended to become a little bit of a refuse area for bits and pieces. So now we have this kind of the organic detritus of bringing down the far corner down there,
right.
And occasionally Dublin City Council remove that.
But you bring your own tools with you?
Oh, I do.
Can't
Yeah.
leave them here, yeah.
I do. I have to bring them backwards and forwards whenever I'm doing the work. Yeah.
How often would you come up to work on the place?
Well, that's generally contingent for the ongoing maintenance would be whenever David is. It's consistent with the timing of his tours. When David's having a tour, I'll be here on the Friday evening or the Saturday morning, and I'll spruce the place up. And generally, then whenever I'd have time, I'd come and I just start one corner and work my way. And it's kind of there's a great old heritage to this place, apart from the religious. I mean, a lot of the dust of the denizens of Donnybrook lie, and in its environs, lie in this area here, this piece of sacred ground. And it's a place well worth preserving, even if you haven't a bit of religion. As is, as is.
Good afternoon, everyone. Right, well, just to tell you, my name is David Neary, and I've been giving these tours for about 12 years, and this is Tahir, who is making a film along with a local lady, Glenda Chimino, about the cemetery. So if you've no objection, you'll be on screen eventually. Okay, right. Well, first of all, you're all very welcome, and this is a very ancient place indeed, because there has been a church or a religious building here for the past 800 years. And in the cemetery are the remains of two churches. The first is facing us here. It's the last remaining wall of the Catholic Church that stood here between 1786 and 1866. August 1860, a meeting was held in this building of local people, and they'd seen Haddington Road Church built and Star of the Sea Sandymount, and they rightly thought that they deserved something better than they already had. And at that meeting,
the sum of £1,000 was collected, which was a huge sum then, because the pound sterling in 1860 had the purchasing power of £100 sterling today. So the equivalent of £100,000 was collected at that meeting. I don't know if he was present, but a local man also contributed to the money needed for the church. And he lived at Muckross Park, and he was an extensive builder, and his name was Mr. Cranny. I can't remember his Christian name at the moment. But he had come to Dublin maybe 20 years earlier, and he'd been apprenticed to a shoemaker in Killarney. Good afternoon. And he had married his master's daughter, and they came to Dublin and they set up a shoe shop there which prospered. And when they had prospered very well, they began to build houses, and they built many of the houses that are now along Marlborough Road and Elgin Road. And Mr. Cranny's daughter married Mr. Plunkett's son, and amongst their children was Joseph Mary Plunkett, the 1916 leader.
I love the interaction that I have with people, and I make a point of welcoming them, making them feel at home, and also making it clear that if they wish to come into the tour by giving their own information or asking me questions, that it's very welcome. I like the tour to be a kind of conversation.
Hello, my name is
Please,
Belinda. Hello,
please.
sorry.
Please.
Hi, I'm the director of the film about the tour.
Yes.
And just some of you came late, and I came late, so you haven't met me. And I just want to make sure that everybody's all right if you're interested in the film, because we really don't want to have somebody come along and say, you have to cut my picture out. So if you want to sign saying that you released it, that's fine. But as long as you're not going to object, you're not going to do it. I'm assuming everybody is releasing it. Okay. Because nobody's done anything particularly embarrassing. Nobody's here with the mistress.